I'm very glad to be here with you. And the issue of Christian persecution in many countries is a dramatic daily issue in the news that, thanks God, Pope Francis never forget to mention. Being a Middle East correspondent for La Stampa, I'm quite familiar with the Muslim world, especially with the Muslim world. But I know quite well the situation in many other countries, not only Muslim countries, because I wrote a book called Where Christians Die, and unfortunately, unfortunately, it's only in Italian and it has been translated in Spanish, and yeah, okay, it's okay, and it has been translated in Spanish, not in English, unfortunately. But it's a kind of journey through the countries most problematic for the Christian minority, and from the Middle East to India, which is something we will talk about in this panel. I want to explain to you why me, as to be honest, I'm a very, very, very light believer, but why I decided to write a book about Christian persecution in the world. It happened, I decided that the issue deserved special attention when I was in London. I lived in Jerusalem for 4 years, and then I moved to London, where I was correspondent for my newspaper. And when I was in London, I met a priest, a Franciscan friar, Father Michael Seed. And Father Michael Seed, for almost 10 years, went to Downing Street to bring the Mass to the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, entering from the back door, and I couldn't understand why. And actually, Prime Minister Tony Blair converted to Catholicism only when he finished his mandate in 2007. But Father Seed explained to me that even in the tolerant, more than tolerant London, and in the more than tolerant United Kingdom, a Catholic can't be prime minister, because the Queen is the head of the Anglican Church, so a Catholic can't be a prime minister. So immediately came back to my mind all the situation in the Middle East, where I faced the problem of the Christian minorities, and I realized that I never saw that even in the Western country, like in UK, there could be a kind of religious problem for a minority. It has nothing to do with persecution, of course. London is the best place for every religion and community and minorities. But still there was this problem. And Father Seed explained to me that the media couldn't be informed, and that's why he was obliged to do everything carefully. So, I realized at that point that we in the Western world, we have a problem with Christian persecution. It's usually something that it's not so often in the news, even if it's very important. It's in the global news, but in our Western media, it's not so often in the news. And so I started to think of it, and I also started to travel. So I went to India, I went to Orissa, and I arrived immediately after the massacre in Orissa. It was in 2009, and then I went to Indonesia, and the Middle East, of course, but I also met a priest escaped from North Korea. And so, my idea was this, more or less. The Régis Debray, a French intellectual, is famous because he fought on the side of Che Guevara, said once that Christians in the Middle East are the blind perspective of the Western world on this part of the world. They are too Western, too linked to the Western culture to be a cause for the third world supporters, but they are also too Oriental for the freedom fighter in the Western world. So, by the way, they are alone. I mean, even if it's not true, they are perceived again as a projection of the Western power, of the white power. It's not true, as you know, but still, the Western world has never been so weak, and so the Christians everywhere in the world, they are paying the price. There is a Pew poll, and according to Pew, 70% of the religious persecution at the moment in the world regard Christians, Christian community. So it's a very worrying date and a very worrying situation. So, I mean, I'm going to let our guests to explain the panel, and to start with Chad Bauman and James Ponniah. We began to talk about the deteriorating situation for Christians in South Asia in the last panel. Chad Bauman, could you please describe in more detail the growing social and political challenges Christians, many of whom date their presence in the 1st century AD, are facing in India? Then I'll pass the word to James Ponniah, but we can start, I think, with Chad Bauman.
Right, well, thank you, and thanks to the organizers for bringing us and also for arranging the audience with the Pope this morning, which gave me something to be nervous about other than this presentation. I think my co-author and colleague, Professor Ponniah, who is also Father Ponniah, was even more nervous than me because he was meeting his boss for the very first time. So thanks for having me. I'm going to speak in generalizations, and we can unpack some of this in the conversation afterwards. But Christians in India today are under two main forms of pressure: legal pressure and violent sorts of pressure. And in terms of legal pressure, we can divide it into three main forms of legal pressure. The first are the freedom of religion laws. Critics call them anti-conversion laws. These are laws which were encouraged by Hindu nationalists beginning in the 1950s and 60s and are now on the books in about half a dozen Indian states. They're laws which prohibit conversion by force, fraud, and inducement. And of course, on the surface of it, there's nothing particularly objectionable about that kind of prohibition. But the devil, of course, is in the details. And in this case, the problem is that the terms are very ambiguous. Even take force, which seems to be the clearest of the terms. The law actually stipulates that threats of eternal damnation is a kind of force. So that makes far more complex the idea of force and turns it into something much broader and more difficult to define. And then if you take the term inducement, that also is a very ambiguous term. Clearly it's an inducement to offer somebody money to convert to one's faith. But what about charity? What about healing in a Christian hospital? What about education in a Christian institution at a reduced rate? Or what about the promise to a lower caste Hindu that she might be treated with more dignity and respect in a Christian community where, at least theoretically, and I need to stress theoretically, there isn't caste prejudice? Of course, we know from Professor Shaw's presentation that there still is. So the term is all of the terms are incredibly ambiguous, and that ambiguity leaves them open to wide interpretation and to abuse. And they're very frequently used to harass Christians who are brought into police stations and booked under these laws. So that's the first kind of legal pressure. The second kind of legal pressure that Indian Christians experience comes from the fact that the right to proselytize, by which I mean the right to intentionally try to convert another person, has never been firmly established in Indian law. So the Indian Constitution does actually enshrine within it the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion. But the problem is that the Supreme Court in subsequent rulings separated propagation, as in the right to spread knowledge about one's religion, from the right to proselytize, and said that only the former was actually a guaranteed right. So the third kind of legal pressure then is legal pressure from the reservation system, and Professor Shaw talked about this morning. But basically, because of the fact that a Dalit Hindu or a low-caste Hindu who converts to Christianity loses access to these reservations, many Christians see this legal arrangement as a disincentive to conversion. And it also sets up a situation where many low-caste Hindu converts to Christianity actually obscure and hide the fact officially that they have converted, which is one of the reasons why Christians get undercounted in India. But it also leads to all kinds of tensions because it's a widely engaged in swindle, and it's widely known that lots of people do this, and that creates tensions between Hindus and Christians. And that fed into some of the violence in Kandhamal, Orissa. So let me move then to the two main forms of violent pressure that the Indian Christian community experiences today. So one is the large-scale riot, and these are the ones that get the attention. And they've been relatively well covered by the media. There were riots in Tamil Nadu in 1982, in the Dangs, Gujarat in 1998, and most famously in Kandhamal, Orissa in two rounds, 2007 and 2008. And in that violence, there were 50 to 100 Christians killed, probably around 30,000 in refugee camps, probably 15 to 20,000 permanently displaced from the region, and there were only about 150,000 Christians in the region to begin with. Mostly the youth were displaced. There were also Hindus who were affected quite negatively by that, lost their lives, lost their homes, and of course, as some of you know, the second round of violence in Kandhamal was touched off when a popular but controversial Hindu Swami, Lakshmananda Saraswati, was assassinated, maybe with Christian involvement, in cold blood in his own ashram while he was celebrating the birthday of Krishna. So these are well known, they've been well covered, but less well known is what I call everyday acts of violence. These are more diffuse assaults on Christian groups and communities all over India, and I call them everyday to make a couple of points. The first is that they are quite literally every day. About 300 to 350 of these are documented every year, so they take place on an everyday basis. They're everyday in a second sense, and that is that they've become rather unremarkable. They're not covered in the press except in kind of chronicles of these incidents. People expect them. They're almost normal. And they're everyday in a third sense, and that is that they've become routinized, stylized, and they follow certain kinds of well-worn patterns. For example, the usual way that these attacks happen is that a group of Christians is attacked while evangelizing, or even sometimes just while worshiping, by local groups associated with Hindu nationalist organizations. They're berated, they're beaten up, sometimes severely, sometimes not as much. They're paraded through town, sometimes stripped, taken to the police station where colluding police officers book them under some of the laws that we talked about earlier, and then hold them for a few hours or even a few days, requiring bribes or bail to get them out. So that's the general pattern. There's lots of other patterns, but in general, that's the sort of usual pattern of these attacks. And it seems to be a bit of a script that Hindu nationalist groups follow. The other way that this violence is patterned is in the targeting. So while the large-scale riots that I talked about earlier are rather imprecisely targeted, and they affect all groups mostly equally, the everyday acts of violence against Christians are actually, do have very clear targeting. And in these everyday, more diffuse acts of violence, Pentecostal groups are substantially disproportionately targeted. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I can talk about that more when we get time for conversation, but I'd like to leave more time for our colleagues, so I think I'll end there for now.
Thank you very much. As you already introduced your colleague, Mr. James Ponniah, and he's based in India. And he conducted many research all over India in recent months about how Christians are responding to this challenging they are facing. So could you tell us about the surprising way in which the Christian community has responded to the growing harassment and violence against their community?
So thank you very much for your question. I did my field work in different parts of India from May to August, and it was conducted mostly among the Catholics, except about 10 Protestants and evangelicals in in Bangalore with the help of Tim Shaw. Otherwise, the data I have is mostly from the Catholic community. Looking at the surprising way in which Christians have responded to this, so I leave out the first part because that's a known way of response. When you attack, I attack. Especially when the government fails to protect you, then you organize yourself into a physical force to give back. So the second response is a restorative step, as I have put it, because when people are in violent situation, when they attack each other, the Christian leaders and Hindu leaders came together and they visited these places, especially in Tamil Nadu in the year 1982. Bishop Arakasamy and the religious leader, the Hindu religious leader, Adihalar, both of them went there and met the people and tried to diffuse the situation of violence. And on that occasion, they also started a particular forum called Thiruvarul Peravai in Tamil, which meant the Forum of Divine Grace. In the subsequent years, this particular forum also played a crucial role in diffusing the tension between Christians and Hindus. And further on, it also went on to also ease the tension between also Muslims and Hindus in the later years. So this forum is about 25 years old, and it has played a greater role in restoring peace in that area. The third way in which the Catholics have responded to the situation is introspective efforts. By this I mean certain seminars, workshops held among the Catholics in different seminaries and different centers of dialogue, invited the Hindus, pro-Hindu writers, the social activists, the neutral observers, the social scientists, to look into why Christians are being targeted. Okay? First, to understand the phenomena of Hindu party itself, the Hindu Parivar, what are their agenda and what are they trying to target at, and why Christians are being targeted, etc., etc. So this way they are able to understand themselves better in the light of how they were being perceived by the Hindu fundamentalistic groups. And the fourth response is exploring new ways of friendship with the non-Christians. Okay? So the bishops, for instance, after the violence in Mangalore, the bishops together visited the temples and the mosques and met the religious leaders of Hinduism and Islam, and they were trying to cultivate friendship with them. And Bishop of Bangalore, Bishop Bernard Boras, he went to the to the mutt of Swami Bangaranda and paid his homage when he died. And a couple of such occasions, they were able to cultivate good friendship with them. And also I have noted also in Puri, which is in the state of Orissa, where the violence in Kandhamal took place. They went to a famous place called Puri. There they had took part in the religious festivals of Hindus. They pulled the rope and of the car, Teras they call it Yatra. Yatra they partook in. Similarly, in Mangalore they went to Dharmasthala to participate in an annual pilgrimage of Hindus. So such efforts are taken up by Christian leaders to bring about harmony between Christians and Hindus. The fifth response is a new way of responding to the situation, namely the creation of a new portfolio in the Catholic churches, okay? Especially in the dioceses and in the local level, parish level, and in the state level, in the state capital. So these public relations officers, mostly priests, are supposed to be functioning as an interface between the state authorities and the church, and between the church and other religious leaders. Okay, therefore, it is to cultivate friendship, to establish a kind of a relationship with these groups, so that when Christians are under attack, they are able to reach out to them and communicate to them their problems, their concerns, etc. Another important thing that they did was to document the existing structures, existing neighborhoods, with clear data. How many people live in particular area? What are the properties of the church? So that when violence takes place, when attack is done to the Christians, they can produce evidences of what is being attacked. So these are the things that they have maintained. That's another way of responding to a situation of violence. The sixth response I have put it is the strategic collaboration with religious minorities. When the Muslims were affected in Gujarat in the year 2002, the Christians came together and extended their support to the Muslims, and they conducted campaigns, collected money, raised the funds, and sent the relief materials to the Muslims in Gujarat, etc. So a number of Christian leaders, Father Cedric Prakash in Gujarat, who is in charge of a particular center called Prashant, and John Dayal, the director, the Secretary General of AICC, and Catholic Sabha, all these groups were involved in strategic collaboration with the religious minorities. The next way in which they respond is to network with secular forces, like-minded people who uphold the secularism of India. So like that, we have, as I have mentioned there, in Mangalore, there is a partnership with Karnataka Komu Saudra Vaidiga Samaj to fight against the Saffronization of school curriculum and the ban on cow slaughter, homestay attack, and banning of women wearing jeans in the colleges, etc., etc. So these are the number of issues that they collaborated with others. The eighth way in which the Christians responded is the inclusive approach in church's ministry, in the pastoral ministry of the church. Church now realized that now it needs to reach out to everyone, irrespective of the fact that whether you are a Catholic or non-Catholic, whether you are a Hindu or a Muslim. If you are poor, then you are eligible for church benefits. So this is the way in which they responded. And as I put there, one of the Christian organizations also had sponsored a prayer hall in a village. They did not put up a church when the church was demolished. Instead, they had put up a prayer hall in which the religious symbols of different traditions were displayed. And they also had a quotation of Ambedkar because of the Dalit community, etc., etc. So these are some number of ways by which they were able to reach out to others, irrespective of the fact that whether you are a Catholic or a Hindu. And in Kanyakumari district, in a place called Villukuri, the laity of the village came together and formed this particular association called Manidhanaya Kootamaipu, an association of human benevolence. This particular association has now completed 25 years of its service to the people, okay? To the people who are either Christians or Hindus or Muslims, but whomsoever is the needy in the neighborhood, they were able to reach out to them, and they have achieved quite a lot, and they were well covered by the local press. And the ninth way in which the Christians have responded is to celebrate the religious festivals of others, not only Christians but also others. And Bishop of Bangalore this time had held an iftar party in the bishop's house. For the first time, the Muslims were invited over to the bishop's house, and the bishop turned the local his hall in the ground floor into a place where Muslims can perform namaz. And then they went to the first floor to have dinner with them. They were extremely happy, I am told, by the bishop and others. Similarly, another group called Dharma Samanvaya in Mangalore, organization run by a Catholic priest, Father John Fernando, when he was the head of the Department of Christian Chair, in collaboration with 27 other colleges, aims at spreading harmony between students of different religious traditions. Therefore, the Hindus come to know about Hindu festivals, Christian festivals, and Christians come to know about Hindus and Muslims. Therefore, they are able to establish a cordial relationship between Hindus and Muslims and Christians. The 10th way in which Christians respond to this particular challenge is, probably I'll stop here. Thank you.
We have always to check on that side. I hope we will have time to go back to this issue. And let's move now from China to from India to China, which is another very interesting subject. In my book, I was in touch with some Christian community in China, but at the end, I couldn't meet any of them because they explained to me that it was too dangerous for them to talk to me and to explain me exactly how the situation was. So for my book, I switched to North Korea, not because it was easier, it was more difficult, but because I had the chance to meet a priest who escaped from North Korea and is now in Amsterdam. Mr. Fenggang Yang, with his team of scholars, worked a lot on the growing pressure and, somehow even persecution of the Christian community in China, but at the same time, he found out also that that there is also a growing vitality in the community, and that the community is having an important political and cultural impact. So this is something not new, because we know that the more the Christians are under pressure, the more they spread the message of the faith, but tell us more about how it, which kind of effect it has on the one of the biggest and the most important player in the geopolitical arena.
Yeah, thank you. When we turn to China, I think the storyline might have to change. There are certainly difficulties for Christians in China, even persecutions, but in spite of the difficulties, Christianity has been growing rapidly in China. So I think we can imagine that we live in ancient Rome around the year 300. When we look around, there are persecutions to Christians. Even the greatest persecution started in 303 AD and lasted for 8 years before the Edict of Milan that gave the freedom of religion. And that's really what's happening in China. If we look at the persecutions, we may feel very a dim scene. But when we look at the Christian communities and seeing the livelihood of the communities, we see that it's really Christianity will grow in China and grow rapidly. Unless some extraordinary things happen, China will become the largest Christian nation very soon as in about 15 years. And also, perhaps by 2030s or 2040s, maybe a third to two-thirds of the Chinese could become Christian. With a population of 1.3 to 1.4 billion, that's going to change not only China, but also the world. But what extraordinary things that could prevent the Christian growth in China? It wouldn't be persecutions, wouldn't be a ban of Christianity, wouldn't be revolutions or wars, because all of those things happened in China in the 20th century. Yet the Christian growth in China has kept the fast pace, even accelerated, as I will show you with some graph. And also, I think right now, the Christian growth may have passed a critical threshold. Once you pass that threshold, the growth is most likely unstoppable. Christianity may have reached China by the 3rd century, but without talking about those long history, the recent continuous presence of Catholicism in China has been 400 years, and for Protestants, 200 years. By the year 1900, there were about 700,000 to 800,000 Catholics and 100,000 Protestants. And then the first half of the 20th century, there were two major revolutions in China. First, the Republican Revolution in 1911, then the Communist Revolution, 1949. And in spite of these revolutions, Catholics grow about 4 times, and Protestants grow about 10 times within 50 years. Now move to the People's Republic of China era under the communists. We can divide the development, Christian development in China in 2 major periods, 1979. Before 1979, there were severe suppression and even outright eradication of all religions. Christianity was included. And since 1979, because of the economic reforms and opening up to the world, the religious policy has relaxed. There's a greater tolerance of different religions, including Christianity, but there are still restrictions, clearly. In the first 30 years of the People's Republic of China, some historians estimated perhaps about 500,000 Christians died of unnatural death. In spite of that, we can see the Catholic growth from 1950 to 1980 maintained 3 million. That is after the eradication for 13 years, from 1966 to 1979. There was no religion, no church was open. But after that, when they recounted, found that there were still 3 million Catholics. And from that point on, Catholics began this slow growth, but a certain growth. And the official government report is that there are 5.3 million Catholics. But outside estimates, the highest is 12 million. And the Pew Global Christianity Report, published in 2011, report estimated that there were about... Really? Okay. Okay. This here is, okay, I'll just show you the graph, nothing else. The Protestant growth, according to the state official report, increased from 1 million to 3 million in 1980, and then right now is 23 million Protestants. That's according to the state report, all right? Then scholars' estimate is, the latest is by the Pew, again, is 58 million. And this is a conservative estimate. And some people suggest that there could be as many as 130 million Christians in China. This number both came from some Christians and also from the Chinese government internal report. And this is reported by Christianity Today in the year 2008. All right, so I'll skip the diversified growth, different kinds of growth, and try to make a projection. What will happen in the next few decades? The demographers often use this compound annual growth rate for projection of population, and we use the rate based on the last 30 years or last 60 years or last 110 years, different rates from about 6% to 10% each year. Here is a projection. The lower estimate, the middle, and the higher. according to this, now we have, there are about 160 million Protestants in the US, the largest Protestant country, and China could reach that number within the next 10 to 15 years. And if we include Catholics in the US, is 247 Christians in China, in the US, and in China, that number could be reached between 2025 to 2035. Yeah, that's the time. And then how about the proportion in China? The Chinese population is going to reach the highest point around the year 2030, 1.4 billion. And you can see the Christian growth. By 2040, we may have up to 30% of the Chinese population Christian. And perhaps 2040, the mid-range estimate, 32%. And by 2050, certainly would pass half of the population. So this is the estimate based on conservative estimate, not the most generous estimates. So China is destined to become a Christian nation soon. And it's comparable to what happened to the ancient Roman Empire, when the Christian population was about 5 to 10%. That's a critical threshold. Once you pass that critical threshold, it's almost unstoppable for the growth. And Constantine's conversion may not cause the rapid growth, it's the consequence of rapid growth. And that's, China is right around that time. And all the major social trends will point to the most likelihood of continuous growth. So for me, or for many people, I think now, instead of focusing the continuous persecution, I think now it's time to think about what will happen once Christians become a majority in China. And that's the question I pose. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm more and more convinced that I studied Arabic, but I have to study Chinese. And now we move to Indonesia. Mr. Marthen and Mr. Robin Hefner will tell us about the situation in Indonesia. I know I went to Indonesia in the summer 2011, and despite the fact that the constitution protects the, according to the constitution, there are 5 religions accepted in Indonesia, six, but still the situation is, the Christians are facing threats constantly. So to Mr. Tahun, he conducted interview with many leaders and representative of the Christian community, and so I want to ask him about their perception of the political situation in Indonesia. Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? And to Mr. Hefner, I know that he studied a lot about the Christians' place in Indonesia. So how do the community react to the threat they are facing constantly in Indonesia?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure, and I thank the conveners for inviting both of us here. I'm going to provide a little bit of the background on Indonesia, and Marthen will then pick up and speak about the major focus of our report, which is to look at Christian reactions to their circumstance right now. I'm going to focus today on Indonesia. Over the last 12 years of the 30-some years that I've worked in Indonesia, over the last 12 years I've become something of a comparativist, and I'm hoping that perhaps in our discussion, at the very least, we can return to not just Indonesia, but a discussion of what Indonesia might have to say about the conditions and possibilities of plurality and pluralist democracy in at least some other Muslim majority countries. But I'm not going to address that in my remarks. I am going to focus on Indonesia. Perhaps we can address the issue in discussion afterwards. So briefly, I'm going to make 5 basic points. First is the country overview. Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country in the world with about 250 million people, 87.2% of whom are Muslim, and 9.9% of whom are Christian, about 7% are Protestant, 2.9% are Catholic. It's also the 3rd largest and one of the newest of democracies. It's still in transition. It has major imperfections, not least of all on questions of religious freedom, but above all, law enforcement, including the enforcement of laws that have to do with religious freedom. But it is in democratic transition since the fall of the authoritarian Suharto regime in May 1998, and then to today. There have been 3 major national elections since 1999, and each of them, I'll return to this briefly at the end, in each of them, parties, if you will, professing support for public religion have done well. Islamist parties have not only not done well, their numbers have diminished since 1999. So depending on how you define Islamist, roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of about 17% of the electorate today gives their vote to Islamist parties. So there's the general background. It's a background which raises a lot of comparative questions, but again, I'm going to try to address questions more directly relevant to how Indonesia came to be what it is. Marthen will then talk about Christian perceptions. Well, how did Indonesia come to be, to have, if you will, the kind of religious arrangement that it did have? Christians were present since the 16th century, if not earlier, but in small ethnic enclaves in the eastern part of the Indonesian archipelago, an archipelago of some 12,000 islands, 3,000 of whom are inhabited with 300 ethnic populations. The ethnic profile of Christianity in Indonesia continues right up through the 19th century and into the 1950s and 1960s, and it's only after Indonesian independence and, if you will, the attempt and the success at developing an indigenous pastorate that one begins to see a shift away from what was historically a kind of consociational and ethnicized model of religion, of Christianity being identified with certain ethnic groups, not with voluntarism and, if you will, a promise of universal brotherhood and sisterhood. That begins to shift with, if you will, the de-ethnization, the relaxation of that Western and/or ethnic identification in the 1950s and 1966. That accelerates further in 1965-66 when Indonesia, which up to this time had the largest communist party in the non-Muslim world, bar no country, its communist party was implicated in a coup in the aftermath of which there were massacres of nominal Muslims and widespread conversion. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.7 million to 2 million people convert to Christianity. And this, if you will, gives again a further boost to a more voluntaristic understanding of religion and religiosity in the Christian community and in Muslim perceptions of Christianity. Nonetheless, move to point 3, religious governance in Indonesia retains elements of a non-Atlantic liberal model of religious governance. That is, it shows, if you will, the legacy of a Dutch model of corporatist consociationalism, whereby the state is given the authority, and most people agree that the state should have the authority as to identify what is a legitimate religion, and 6 today are recognized. And those religions which are not recognized as legitimate religions are at a serious disadvantage in terms of all manners of rights and freedoms. But that situation, though, that has been periodically challenged by Christians, is for the most part tolerated as, if you will, a price of operating in a country where the majority is Muslim. Today, move forward to point 4, today, in the aftermath of some 15 years of transition, Indonesia remains a place which is imperfectly democratic, but nonetheless hopeful. As I've said, the results of national elections have consistently been different from those that we've seen in countries like Egypt, or for that matter, even Tunisia in North Africa, with the majority of the electorate continuing to cast their vote for parties committed to multi-confessional nationalism. And this is one of the most distinctive and important features of both the Muslim population in Indonesia as a whole, the strength of commitment not merely to nationalism, but to multi-confessional nationalism, a nationalism which Muslims themselves, the majority of Muslims, embrace and see as an ideal for which they have fought, they have paid dearly, and to which they continue to subscribe, one that gives, if you will, operative freedom to those religious minorities, including Christians, who are recognized by the Ministry of Religion in Indonesia. There are nonetheless serious problems. Since the transition to democracy, there have been an uptick in what was already a fairly widespread pattern of violence against churches, including church burnings. It's become much more difficult in the post-Suharto, post-98 era for Christians to secure permits to build churches. The pattern is highly regionalized in certain areas where Islamist parties and Islamist sentiment is a little bit stronger, and in which militias, organized by Islamists, exercise a greater force. That continuing pressure of democratically elected officials, pressure by Islamist groups, has resulted in a situation in which, if you will, political leaders who might themselves be multi-confessional nationalists have often caved in to Islamist pressures, a point to which Marthen will return in a moment. Nonetheless, I'll end with just an observation as regards points of optimism in Indonesia. Indonesia remains a country in which, I don't have time to develop this today, it's the most associationalized variety of Islam in the entire world. What do I mean by that? We have a 25 million strong Muhammadiyah organization and a 35 to 40 million strong Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest social welfare and educational organizations in the Muslim world. Both organizations, however much they are fraught with internal tension, are officially and substantially committed to pluralist democracy. And again, the vision and promise of multi-confessional nationalism. So this associationalism hasn't quite created, if you will, the habits of the democratic heart that some Tocquevillians might hope and aspire for. Not fully, but it has nonetheless put wind in the sails of that multi-confessional vision and a commitment on the part of the majority of Muslims to pluralist democracy. The question of democracy is not in question. Its compatibility with Islam is broadly accepted. Both ethnographic studies and polls confirm this again and again quite strongly. Nonetheless, since the period of 1998-99, the transition to electoral democracy, the greater freedoms of association promised under the Indonesian constitution, and the weakness of law enforcement has provided Islamist militias with if you will, a moment of opportunity and a landscape of opportunity whereby they have been able to use, if you will, their organization and threats of violence, threats that stop just short of terrorist violence. There has been terrorist violence. It's now receded greatly. So the militias rely on, if you will, threats of violence that stop just short of extreme violence so as not to, if you will, run afoul of law enforcement. The future of Indonesia, the future of religious freedom in Indonesia will depend upon a coalition, as Marthen will tell you, a coalition of Christian, Muslim, Hindus, and others Indonesians committed to multi-confessional nationalism and committed above all to the enforcement of those laws on religious freedom, which already exist in Indonesia.
Thank you. I will continue the presentation from Professor Hefner. And we interviewed a number of Christian leaders in different parts of Indonesia. And there was a consensus among the interviews that Christians enjoyed freer and more socially favorable situation prior to heatened social and religious tensions. Several indicators of the general deteriorations in their situations, a heightened frequency of attacks on Christian buildings, church buildings, often on the grounds that those buildings were erected without government permits. Greater difficulty at securing permits for the constructions of church and schools, pressures to restrict the number of Christians in the higher level of state administrations, the implementations of a regional and district level of laws said to be inspired by Islamic Sharia. Viewed from these general perspectives, many Christian leaders feel that the post-1998 political opening, combined with a relative weakening of state law enforcement, as Professor Hefner already said, has resulted in greater restrictions on religious freedom and greater segregations by religious communities. Nonetheless, the official interviewed for this report are unanimous in affirming that the transition to democracy is necessary and important, and that the present circumstances of Christians and other minorities may be only transitional. Although many observers agree that Indonesia has made progress toward democracy, most pointed out that transition to democracy has been accompanied by rising intolerance on the part of some Muslim groups, for example, the Ahmadis and Shias, and weak protections of religious freedom by the state. Many leaders pointed out that the complexities of transitions have also encouraged some Christians to engage in self-reflections or self-critiques. Christian leaders often pointed out segments of the Christian communities had a tendency to be exclusive in their dealings with non-Christians. Part of the self-critics and self-reflection is some Christian leaders have reminded their fellow Christians that building more churches should not be the main goal of their missions. What is more important is that the church should be a blessing for everyone, not only for Christians. The tangible improvement of relations between Christians and mainstream Muslim of the last 15 years, and also with other groups of religious organizations in Indonesia, considered as one of the strongest guarantee for the futures of religious tolerance for social order in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is in the process of transition to a more democratic society, but we also realize that there are still many weaknesses, especially in the role of the state in protecting the religious freedom. I will stop there.
This overview on the situation of Christian in Asia wouldn't be complete without Vietnam. And we have a super expert of Vietnam. And I would like to ask him, I understand from your studies that the situation, I mean, the Christian in Vietnam are still on the side, but still they are working. They are from inside a restricted community. They are contributing to the developing of Vietnam in terms of freedom, in terms of welfare, in terms of, I mean, many kind of contribution. So can you tell us about their interrelation with the society in Vietnam?
Thank you. Thank you for the privilege of participating in this conference. Start with full disclosure. I am an evangelical Protestant missionary to Vietnam for the last 47 years. Though it's a great honor for me to be here, it's a little bit of an assignment from hell, pardon the word, to have to summarize this in just a few minutes. Trust you will, I know you're all able to read our work as well. I want to acknowledge a co-scholar as well as 4 research assistants in Vietnam and many respondents that helped us with our research. It's a commentary on modern Vietnam that none of these wish to be acknowledged or named in our research. And in fact, in my last trip to Vietnam, the Ministry of Public Security helped themselves to a USB and some irreplaceable research papers out of my briefcase when I was out for dinner. Vietnam is the 13th largest country in the world with 90 million people. Vietnam, divided since 1954, was reunited under communism in 1975 after what it calls its second anti-colonial war. The first decade was a total disaster, bringing Vietnam to the brink of national famine. But in 1986, Vietnamese communists made a major policy changes with adopting what they call doi moi, or renovation. It's kind of their version of glasnost and perestroika, only they just adopted perestroika, which is reorganization, not the openness part. And this meant jettisoning Marxist economics and adopting market economic principles and coming up with what has been cleverly called market Leninism. Vietnam remains an authoritarian, though probably not a totalitarian state. This was punctuated only in the last few weeks when Vietnam even restricted, even the Vietnam Communist Party even took more power to itself in a slight revision of its constitution. About 10% of Vietnam's population are Christians. They are of two traditions. There are 8 million Roman Catholics with 4 centuries of Christian history, and evangelical Protestants approaching 2 million with 1 century of history. Both traditions have continued to grow rather remarkably in the 4 decades under a Vietnam united with communism. Using 1972 as a baseline, the Roman Catholic Church, I believe, has grown at an average annual rate of 4.8%, adding an average of 125,000 people per year. This far outstrips Vietnam's current growth rate of population growth rate of 1.1%. In Vietnam, sadly, abortion is the most common method of birth control, and abortions almost equal live births in Vietnam. Over the same period, evangelicals grew from a mere 160,000 to at least 1.6 million, some say more. This is roughly an average annual addition of 35,000 new believers, or a 22% growth rate. The remarkable growth of especially Protestants is just an example of what Professor Johnson talked to us yesterday about, this radical growth, shift of the center of Christianity from the West to the global South. And this happened without foreign missionary presence. This growth has been mostly among ethnic minorities in Vietnam. Vietnam's ethnic minorities number only 14% of the total population, but in the evangelical community, they represent 80%, and there are some serious implications about that. Adversity to Christianity far precedes communism in Vietnam. It's not a very well-known story that Catholics in Vietnam, who predate the French hegemony of Vietnam by 2.5 centuries, were subject to many periods of oppression and strong persecution. According to Catholic historical documents, the minimum number of martyrs during that period is at least 130,000. Christians were strangled, sawn asunder, tied together in long lines, thrown into a river, killed slowly by slicing soft flesh, hacked to death limb from limb with the head being last removed, and tortured with hot tongs. For sport, they were thrown under the feet of elephants as an echo of what happened not far from here many centuries before that. Today you would say Catholics are more restricted than persecuted as in the past. Evangelicals, on the other hand, have experienced their worst persecution since reunification of Vietnam under communism in 1975, between 1975 and the year 2000. The paradigm of the Vietnamese government during that period for a time was either eradication, as was mentioned by Young over here, or at least stop cold. But that, thankfully, has now changed, bettered somewhat, to containment. The containment takes place under some rather remarkable changes in religion policy that happened in the middle of the first decade of this century, around 2002, 2004, 2005, under great pressure because Vietnam wanted to join the World Trade Organization, and the U.S. held the keys to that. Vietnam had to jump through some hoops, especially in the area of human rights and religious freedom. The U.S. used that leverage very well, and Vietnam promulgated a new series of new religion legislation and really stepped back from the systematic government-sponsored brutal programs to force recantation. And now the literature of the Bureau of Religious Affairs and so on talks about containing Christianity, and both Catholic Christians, Catholic churches, and evangelical churches in Vietnam suffer persecution where they are growing, where new churches are being established, and pressure. Wow. We believe that the promise for a better future for Christians in Vietnam lies in appealing to the self-interest of the communist state. Christians, particularly Catholics, evangelicals as well, before 1975 in the South, were a veritable gusher of good works and charity and development work, medical work, education work, and so on. That was completely stopped in 1975 and has resumed now to, or has been allowed to resume to, I would call it a trickle. But interesting, there has been legislation inside the Communist Party that says, in 1990s, it was secret for 8 years, that religion is a need for some people and will remain so for some time. And secondly, religion can contribute to the building of a socialist society. So herein, some of my friends in high places in the Vietnamese government tell me is the promise for the future. This was publicized in '98, but they tell me it still has not been implemented. But if we appeal to the Vietnamese government's self-interest, they have little conscience and little budget to help Vietnam's most vulnerable people. And here are churches, we're talking large numbers of churches, who are willing to work not only in social welfare, poorest and marginalized, drug addicts, leprosy people, and leprosy victims and so on, but also in education and medicine. And this is where I believe the future lies. I think the trajectory is good, though we can expect recidivism from time to time when it comes to oppression and persecution of Christians. I want to just read one sentence in closing here from my paper. It is critical to understand that Christians of both Catholic and evangelical traditions in Vietnam do not see themselves as mere anthropocentric voluntary organizations sharing religious experience and performing social service. They are both unapologetically evangelistic, witnessing to the historic Orthodox Christian truths and calling people to faith in Christ and participation in churches. At their best, they are extremists when it comes to love of neighbor and contending for justice. From this basis, these communities serve as salt and light, contributing not only to their own welfare, but to the common good, and in the measure that they are free to do so, yes, even in adversity. Thank you.
Yeah, we have time. We have time for some. Okay, okay. It's exactly what I'm almost asking. We have time for some question, and I just want to give you a very, very brief feedback, optimistic. Robert Hefner mentioned before Egypt and the situation of Christian in Egypt. I just want to tell you that there are some positive signal in the new constitution which will be voted on 15 and 16 of January. We don't know about the future, but at least in the new constitution, the religious party are banned. It's happened after the experience of the governance of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the three religion of the book, so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they have the right, it's written in the new constitution, not only to profess their faith, but also to build their place. This is something new, and I mean, it's just a positive signal for everybody. So now we have time for a few questions. Okay, we can start from here.
Why are people converting to Christianity in China, do you think, at this rate?
It's a simple question, but worth $1 million. A simple answer is really in the last 100 years, the traditional Chinese culture has been significantly changed or damaged by this forced upon modernization. And many people feel that they lost the value system that they used to know, and so the social enemy is very widely spread. People are looking for new belief system, and Christianity is one of the options that they are available. And so I have an article talks about why young people in the urban areas convert to Christianity, and it's called "Lost in the Market, Saved at McDonald's." It's really Christianity is perceived as modern, rational, and liberating, and also part of the global culture. That's what the modern Chinese are looking for.
Yeah, my name is John Boya. I'm an Indian. This question is to Chad Bauman and James Ponniah. I would like that James Ponniah would answer because he was like back in 80 years in India. He was my teacher when I did my philosophy. So the question is, can we generalize the theme anti-Christian attacks, saying that there are riots, attacks occurring all over India, or can we exclude some regions like, for example, Kerala, where Christians and Muslims, Hindus, there are a specific situation? And second is, these attacks, can we reduce these attacks to merely anti-Christian or anti-religious attacks, or there is always a political motive behind these attacks? So in this case, can we say that these attacks, riots are purely anti-Christian, or can we say that these are anti-Christian political attacks? Thank you.
The data that I have refers only to Orissa, certain parts in Tamil Nadu, as well as Karnataka, okay? But however, this is not totally absent in Kerala as well, because there are a couple of incidents when Christians were attacked. Therefore, if you take these trends seriously, then probably it reflects what's going to take place in to the rest of India, okay? So that said, now the answer to the second question is, definitely, as long as the attack is done on Christians because they are Christians, it is a Christian attack. To the extent it is being motivated by political factors, it is a political attack.
Yeah, this question also refers to Professor Ponniah. In your brief presentation here, you say Christianity's appeal to low caste and tribal people have provoked what you call violent reaction. I think that among the Christians themselves there is discrimination, because I carried out a field research among Dalit, and I saw churches have been closed because of conflicts among Dalits. Still exist separate cemeteries for Dalits and the high caste. So I think the picture is not complete. It is not that only Hindus discriminate Christians, but this goes back to Francis Xavier's time also. The second question is, or observation is, do some of the misunderstandings and violent reactions provoked by some Christians themselves because of their triumphalistic and insensitive evangelization?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Actually, the first part, there is an inner persecution of low-caste Christians within Christianity itself, okay? That's an in-house affair. But that's not politically motivated as the one which we were talked about, okay? I mean, this is not to just brush aside the inner persecutions in Christianity, but our focus was mainly on attack on Christians by non-Christians or politically motivated Hindu groups, okay? The answer to the second question is yes. In as much as Christians, act in a manner which attracts a huge attention from non-Christians or Hindus, okay, and it attracts in a way which is not helpful to the growth of Christianity. To that extent, I think Christians themselves are directly or indirectly responsible for this. But that could be a simplistic way of looking at it. Things are not as simple as we think it is, okay? Yes, but if that's the case, then Christians should be attacked elsewhere in different other parts of India, okay, where also they perform or where they undertake similar kind of process of evangelization. Why do they get attacked here? Therefore, answers are to be found in situation-based realities, okay, which is politically charged and motivated by outside forces or Hindutva political forces, etc.
Hello. This question is for Bob Hefner. I really enjoyed your distinction here between support for Islamism and support for parties who support public religion. And I just would like to ask if you could expound on that for 1 second, because it seems to imply that support for public religion in this case implies a sort of multi-confessional nationalism which is not rooted in a secular model of democracy. So if you could just say a word about that, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, this is a question that comes up all the time in Washington, D.C. when one speaks with people from the State Department, and is related, I think, to, not your question, but their question is related to a tendency to believe that without a full separation of religion and state, and without, essentially, the privatization of religion, there can be no democracy and nor effective religious freedom. And I think there are many cases, not least of all from here in Western Europe, where the tradition of public religion, and as well as state support for religion in education, the maintenance of institutions, one sees a different kind of co-imbrication of state and religion than that which my State Department colleagues are referring to. And in short, in Indonesia, what one has is a variation on a distinctive Western European tradition, not the French, not the Swedes, but basically the Dutch model of consociationalism, whereby the state takes the responsibility, and one can challenge this, and it should be challenged at least on some points in Indonesia. The Ministry of Religion takes responsibility for identifying which religions are to be given state recognition and therefore allowed to play this public role benefiting from public funds. The state is given that role, but at the same time, there are religions outside of those, in this instance now 6 recognized religions, that continue to press for some measure of recognition. So in short, yes, you have an arrangement like that of consociational democracy here in the Netherlands and Belgium, rather than that of a kind of an Atlantic liberal, or more specifically, North American separation of religion and state.
We have just time for one more short question. So, I don't know. Okay.
I'm Roger Bongiovanni from Urbaniana University. I just want to ask a question to Professor Yang. What is the concern for ethical questions among the Christian communities? Ethical questions. Some ethical questions.
Ethical questions?
Ethical, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more? What do you...
You were just talking about the growth of the number in Christianity,
yes.
But I would like to hear something about how it is, how the concern for ethics is growing among the Christians there, because of many. The growth of population means also how to deal with ethical questions.
Yes, thank you for the question. As China developing market economy, this morality has become a big concern, because there's a lot of problems. People are losing orientation, ethical, moral orientation. Christianity is perceived as one that provides clear ethics or moral values. And also now Christian, it's not all political, it's really Christian communities helping each other. And also they do this social called charities and public benefit programs. Like in 2008, when there was the huge earthquake in China, Christians, both the above ground and underground Christians, moved into the disaster area quickly and stayed there for more than a year. You know, after a year, they were still there when the others already left after the initial help. So this kind of actions really further help the appeal of Christianity to other Chinese. And in the market area, I interviewed many business people. You know, among the Chinese Christian business people, the Max Weber's thesis is very popular. They see this the Protestant ethic and Chinese style rational capitalism or market economy as compatible. They are trying to steer the market transition to a more with ethical concerns rather than this crony capitalism.